There's so many things that are going on in the world right now that are often incredibly confusing to people. People are struggling more and more and more to see why other people think what they think. Culture is no longer linear. It is now entirely fragmented. And that fragmentation means that we don't really understand what the other people are doing anymore. So understanding different cultures in different places in different times has never been more important, I think. We're surrounding ourselves with people that have very, very similar rules to us, and we're not meeting people who have quite different rules to us. And cultural change doesn't happen that fast, but when it does happen, everything changes with it.
Hi, and welcome to Metaconscious Leaders, where today we'll be examining the forces that shape how we live, lead, and create meaning. Not just our conscious choices, but the deeper currents of assumptions and norms that feel so natural that we stop even noticing them. Our guest today is the perfect person to help us do this. He is Oliver Sweet. Oliver is one of the world's leading business anthropologists and the head of ethnography at Ipsos, formerly Ipsos Murray, one of the world's largest market research firms based in London. Oliver argues that many of the answers we're looking for aren't inside our heads at all, but in our culture. He globally directs cultural and ethnographic research that helps organizations understand human behavior beyond superficial statistics. For over 2 decades, he's been studying how people actually live, decide, and behave across 35 different countries. His most notable client brands include Coke, IKEA, Google, and Dyson, as well as foundations and governments helping to decode why people really do what they do. In his new book, which is very much the topic of today's conversation, The Rules That Govern Us, he reveals that our choices aren't purely personal, they're cultural. And in this conversation, I want to explore not just Oliver's work, but what it means for how we live and lead today, and how it may guide us to navigate unfolding challenges in this time of awakening. So welcome, Ollie, to
Ollie,
Metaconscious Leaders, and thank you so much for putting the time aside to be our guest today.
thanks for having me on. It's a great podcast, so I'm looking forward to seeing what we cover.
Thank you. And before we move forward, I'd really like to give a shout out for Dr. Lolly Mancy, who introduced us, and the two of you know each other quite well and have a lot of conversations, I understand.
Yeah, we've been chatting quite a lot actually. For two people who've never actually worked together, we have a lot of overlap. So occasionally we get on a call, probably once a month, and have a general chat, and we kind of seem to sort of bounce off each other and get lots of ideas from each other's conversations. So I think Lolly is a fantastic person to follow because her thinking is really out there in terms of how we develop AI in a new world in a kind of very collaborative and constructive way that creates a good culture rather than a bit of a divisive culture. So yeah, she's
Yeah,
brilliant.
completely agree with you. So before we get into culture, the hidden rules, and your wonderful book, will you give us a bit of backstory, Ollie? How did you get into anthropology and ethnography? And by the way, could you clarify what the words mean? Because I need to go and just check up on ethnography. It's not one that I use a great deal.
I've written a book about my ethnographic fieldwork experiences of the last 20 years, and I haven't used the word ethnography once because it's such a confusing and slightly befuddling world to use for so many people in the world. So my route into all of this was very circuitous. I wanted to change the world. I was young, ambitious, and thought the world was wrong. So I had a series of jobs in politics where I worked at a think tank for an MP, worked for a PR organization. And about every 6 months, I tended to move because I didn't like what this organization was doing or this person was advocating. And then I realized that politics wasn't what I thought it was. It was just two parties clashing, and it wasn't really a great way to change the world. And I sort of ended up going into research, and I absolutely loved it. I was able to look at the world analytically and come up with a point of view, and therefore the suggestions on how to change the world, be that through new policy or and even a new product or brand or whatever, you started to see the change quite quickly because it was evidence based and people wanted evidence. So I had about, no, I think I had about 8 jobs in 5 years in politics. And then I settled at Ipsos Mori doing research. And I've been here for the last 20 years. because I love it.
Okay.
Actually, and then I had another fantastic story of a great boss. I have a great boss story. Not many people have a great boss story, and I feel really privileged to have one. I was a psychology grad when I came into Ipsos. This wonderful lady called Johanna Shapira, an American, well, she's Canadian, but she worked in America for years for Ogilvy as a business anthropologist, as an ethnographer. And she started up a unit at Ogilvy, and then she came over to the UK to start one in the UK as well. And she looked at me and she sort of said, do you really think the answers all lie in people's heads? And over the course of a couple of years, we had these sort of ideological battles or debates, if you like. And she taught me the importance and the power of anthropology to look at culture and how culture affects what we do. And Johanna was wonderful because she taught me and my friend Vic an enormous amount about the world of anthropology and then how to apply it in the world. There's a lot. I mean, I've done all the kind of reading in anthropology now, and I have a tie up with the anthropology department at UCL. So I've got a good understanding, but it's always sort of there in me that I've got a psychology degree, not an anthropology degree. So I think that writing this book about anthropology and how it's applied in the world today is sort of my way of kind of going back to university and sort of going back and going, here's my anthropology degree. Well, that's my hope anyway. So she taught me an enormous amount. And so about anthropology and about the fieldwork practice of anthropology, which is ethnography. So in a research setting, ethnography means that we go and spend lots of time with our target audience and do what they do and go where they go and see what they see. So one of my first projects when I started out in the ethnography team under Johanna was to go and spend time with young kids who lived on an estate in Lewisham and try to understand how they use the space and what that means to them, because the estate was being redesigned and revamped by the local authority, and they wanted to see how they could make it more inclusive for young people.
Yeah.
What I ended up doing was just hanging around with groups of young kids for a day at a time. I would hang out with one group, and another day I'd hang out with another group. I'd talk to them along the way. They thought I was a pretty weird prospect, this weird anthropologist following them around. But when you get into it, people really trust you and they will go along and they'll take you with them. And I remember walking down the streets and these guys were, they looked a little bit, I'll be honest, a bit aggressive. They had swagger about them. They would walk in a bit of a line and everyone else in the street had to walk to the side. And they would kind of look at people in the eye a little bit too long. And they would sort of come across this way. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure I want to hang out with them. But then they went down a side street and then they jumped on top of a wall and then they walked along the wall and then they jumped on top of a garage where on top of that garage, nobody could see them anymore. They were out of sight. And then suddenly they became these playful kids again. They suddenly started laughing at each other. They were like, oh, you never guess what Amit did at school today. It was so funny. He answered this question really stupidly. And the teacher was like, I don't even know where you've come up with this from. And it was suddenly they were kids again. And you realize that these kids grew up in very small, in households with very small space, amounts of space that they would share with their brothers and sisters in their bedrooms. And then they went out on the street and fundamentally they were being all aggressive because they were a bit scared. So they were kind of repelling other people. And as soon as they'd found their little hidey hole, suddenly that was their living room and
Yeah.
they could be kids again. So
Yeah.
all they needed was a safe space.
Yeah.
Apparently, these kids who looked like the aggressive ones on the estate, the ones you wanted to avoid, they were really sweet. They were lovely. So that's what we
This was
do
a
in
kind of
ethnography.
that was a kind of aha moment then, is it, for you, in terms of thinking to yourself that actually this is more about what's happening externally than internally, more about culture than
Yeah,
psychology?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. It was. And it was a real turning point for me in so many ways because that project there was really about how you design space. So it's got nothing to do with psychology, really. It's how you design space. And the space dictates the culture. So the space in which you live means that certain spaces can be safe and certain spaces are unsafe, right? So
Yeah.
how do you build that into urban design in a way that everyone can live harmoniously? Yeah. So and that was a turning point for me. Absolutely.
And very quickly then, before we get on to the book, you also do a lot of work with businesses, with the brands that I've mentioned up at the top there, Coke, IKEA, and so forth. What kind of work do you do with them? And yes, can you just say a little bit about that, and also the work you do with governments and organisations beyond the local authority that you've just been talking about?
Yeah. So the idea behind business anthropology and ethnography, so hanging out with people, is the core mechanism with which I go and do a research project. But the research project can lead to many, many different things. So that might be, so for a lot of the work we do with sort of Coke or Google, it's really trying to understand what people's deep values are and what's very, very important. And if you can understand what's really meaningful to them, then you can start to embody that in a brand. So certain brands might want to come across as enabling and helpful, particularly if you have a presence on the internet, right? How can you be a very helpful brand to enable you to be the best you? How can you do that? And really what we want to do is we want to look at kind of some of the cultural values that sit at the heart of how people live. So what you're essentially doing is looking at things like community and family and connection, friends, and how do friends and family help you be your best you? And what is it about that enabling effect that a technology company can also help you be the best you? So, for instance, we did some work in Brazil, how people on helpfulness, and we found that there's this wonderful sort of sense in a family that is kind of surprise help is just everywhere. So people will constantly kind of drop around your house and go, "Oh, hey, by the way, I made too much of this food yesterday, and I thought I'd drop some around for you. Here you go. Bye. I'm off now." And there's that kind of like wonderful surprise. You're like, "Oh wow, I've just received a gift. That's so kind."
All right.
So that how do you build that into technology? How do you build surprise gifts into the infrastructure in which you work? So there's stuff like that. There's another piece of work that we're currently doing, which is how do you harness national pride when it comes to big sort of momentous events. So whether that's to do with the World Cup, the Olympics, these kinds of moments of like connection. And again, what we're there to do is to look at what celebration looks like. So we try and so at the moment we're doing some work actually in some far-flung places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to try and look at what national pride looks like and what celebration means to people. Again, that's this sort of idea of unity. How are people coming together and how are they celebrating together? What are the rituals involved? What are the foods involved? What are the songs that are involved? What do those songs evoke in people? And we kind of map what those are. And again, you can then, once you've figured out what those things are, you can then put those into your brand and communications, into your advertising, into the events that you run. And therefore, you're a brand that becomes far more relevant.
To what extent? Don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, but to what extent is that not greenwashing, but the equivalent of, or can be? To what extent it can be used as a way of manipulating, as a way of appearing to be something other than, in order to be able to garner more votes, or to be able to control or manipulate or sell more product?
I mean, we're working in a private sector scenario here. There's no doubt that these companies are doing it in order to uh, create a better profit margin, without a shadow of a doubt. That's what they're doing. But you can do that in many, many different ways. And one of the things that I think that I hold on to a lot is that the work, particularly a lot of the companies I work for, they're incredibly out of touch with a lot of what ordinary people are doing. And they are going to find ways to sell more products and maximize their profit margin, that's for sure. But one of the things I hope that I do is I show the big man what the little man is doing. And that's a phrase that I actually picked up from a documentary movement. And that's what documentary should really be doing, is showing the big man what the little man is doing. And hopefully by doing that, you are making every product and brand that people have a lot more relevant. I'm not particularly interested in projects where someone comes to me and says, "I've got this product and I really want you to find a way for me to sell it." If that product is harming someone, if that product is something that someone doesn't fundamentally want, then
Okay.
no.
Yeah, good.
I'm not going to go and try and find hooks in that you're going to go, right, I really think you should buy this, but I don't like it. Oh, but doesn't it sit with national pride really well? You're like, oh, okay, maybe. I only work for, like, so I do a lot of work for IKEA, and I think that they have a great philosophy on this as well, which is they are not trying to sell products. They are trying to make products that people want and need. Like, the way you set out your home is so complicated that they don't want to sell extra stuff to people. They want to sell stuff to people that makes their life easier.
Yeah, understood.
I think one of the work I did for IKEA recently, one of them said, I honestly think that a hook is probably the most important thing that we sell, because people have so much stuff lying around. They just need to hang it on a hook. And I was like, that's genius. It's lovely, right? A hook is so
Absolutely
helpful and
true.
useful. So yeah,
That's absolutely true. I
yeah,
love hooks.
yeah.
So to your book, the title, The Rules That Make Us, How Culture Shapes the Way We Act, Think, Believe and Buy, released, I believe, on February the 26th. It's a release date. Do you have a copy of it there? Because mine hasn't yet arrived.
No, mine
You
hasn't
haven't?
arrived either.
Okay.
No, it's sad to say.
Put an image of the cover up on the screen. It's released February 26th, and the core idea is that culture is the invisible architecture shaping human lives, from relationships to consumption, beliefs, and policy. And it changes the notion that behavior is mainly driven by individual cognition. So this is clearly, well, for me, it's clearly a really important book at this time. Why do you think it's so important and relevant today, Ollie?
So there's so many things that are going on in the world right now that are often incredibly confusing to people. You can wake up in the morning and read the news, and many of us have this moment of like, really? Why? Why is that happening?
Yep.
So at the point of recording, the riots are going on in response to a lot of the actions in ICE and and the death of Alex Pretty, and I've forgotten the lady who was killed before her as well. But there's so much of it going on, and yet there is also so much response going from politicians and a lot of people who support those politicians who say what ICE is doing is right. So you've got this, like, people are struggling more and more and more to see why other people think what they think. Now, in reality, what's happening is culture is fragmenting. It's going all over the place. What used to happen in the world when I started my job 20 years ago is that you would look at mainstream culture and dominant culture. And then you would look at whatever was going on at the edges, and that was emergent culture. These were the things that were popping up and cropping up.
Okay.
That might have been hip hop culture in the sort of 80s and 90s. And then what happens is mainstream culture moves in to kind of become that hip hop culture becomes part of mainstream culture, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly these hip hop artists get really big followings, they get quite a lot of money, and lots of more people follow them, and suddenly become part of mainstream culture. And you can kind of map where culture is going. I'd say from the turn of the century onwards, with the rise of social media and television as entertainment and all of these other different ways in
And
which
the
we end up,
internet.
the internet has been absolutely algorithmically transformative in that respect. We are now living in a space where emergent culture might happen in one direction, but it might also happen in the other direction as well, and in a different place, and in a different place. And all of those things will emerge and become successful. Culture is no longer linear. It is now entirely fragmented. That fragmentation means that we don't really understand what the other people are doing anymore. And we talk about living in these sort of digital echo chambers. And that's true. What's going on inside those echo chambers is those feel like complete worlds to those people. So understanding different cultures in different places in different times has never been more important, I think. So a lot of my early years in research meant that I went to other countries. And whenever you go to another country, you're like, wow, this is so different. They don't use cutlery, or they don't shake hands. They want to keep their
Yeah.
distance from me.
Yeah.
There's 100,000 different things that happen when you when you go to a different country. You go, that's really bizarre and crazy. And I still love it. Going to a different country and seeing cultural differences is so fascinating, and it makes you challenge who you are and how you practice. I went and spent a bit of time in India, and suddenly I actually think it's much better to eat with your hands than it is with your cutlery. It's so much more enjoyable. You're in touch with your food. It's great. But, all of these things are different. But what's happening now, which I think is why this is a sort of book of now, is that we have so many differences in how we think and what we believe within our own country, more than we've
Yeah.
ever had before.
Yeah.
And we're becoming more and more out of touch with what other different subcultures think and feel and believe. That I think it's time to start talking about culture a lot.
Yeah. And what is your definition of culture?
There are many definitions of culture that I tend not to follow, and I apologize to my academic friends for that, because culture is inevitably bound up with various different ways of life, with ritual, with what meaning people adopt, shared rituals and shared behaviors, all of those things. And I think that the more we go down that line, the more complicated culture sounds. So ultimately, what I'm trying to do with the book is first of all, is to give people the simplest definition that I can find of culture. And the simplest definition I can find is a set of shared meanings and learned behaviors. And I think if we look at it from shared meanings and learned behaviors, we pretty much encompass everything there is to do with culture. So what do certain things, like, do we have when we see a government institution, do we have actually base that in far more practical terms. When we see a police officer, do we feel a sense of safety or do we feel a sense of fear? Right. And that is based on a shared meaning that you and I have. But you and I you may fear a policeman, I may feel safe with a policeman. So we suddenly have a different set of shared meanings. Right. So there's lots of different shared meanings that we need to map out. And then the learned behaviors is how we continually learn how to behave. So I talk about the home as the site of cultural apprenticeship. The home is where you learn everything there is to know about the world, how to act when it comes to getting up in the morning, how to act when you go to school, how to act when you eat, how to, what the sense of hierarchy and authority is in the world. It teaches you the rules of life. So that's learned behaviors, and we're constantly learning.
And you've suggested there the idea of the cultural trinity
Yes.
within your book that kind of wraps those up, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. What I wanted to do is the book has got a whole bunch of stories from fieldwork experiences, from some kind of amusing ones about when I went to India and China and I was really out of place and I felt really stupid, and as well as hanging out on the estates in Lewisham. But fundamentally, what I wanted to do was go beyond the stories to give people a framework to think about culture, and that framework you can see everywhere in the world. So I think there's three parts to analyzing culture. One is to look at people's identity. So who do people want to be, and how do they want to be seen by other people? We're all putting on a performance all the time, which is related to our identity. So what's our identity is the first part. The second part is, how does that relate to the communities that we're in? And fundamentally, those communities, the important part of those communities are the conversations that we have. What type of conversations do we have in our work as a community, amongst our friends? What do we have? What kind of conversations happen on social media? The internet is a community that you go into, and some of those conversations will be different whichever community you're part of. So that's a very important second part, relates to the community, and the third part is your belief systems. What level of morality do you have? What do you think is right and wrong in the world? And that really is part of your shared meanings. So how do we see authority in the world? How do we see decisiveness? How do we see, these are kind of things that we value. And by mapping those three things, we can get a very good description of what kind of culture you are in.
Right.
And I think that
So
that becomes very useful for organizations. So because I make recommendations to governments and brands. And if I dress them up in that way, then people can do something about it. They can say, okay, we need to change the conversation in the communities, for example.
right. So identity, community, belief systems, they're the kind of cultural operating system. And you say that culture creates the rules that make us.
Exactly
What
that.
are these hidden rules that most of us perhaps are, well, unconsciously at the moment, following?
Yeah, they are a set of unconscious behaviors. And every time you walk into a room or meet a new person or go out for dinner or do anything out in the world, you are constantly conforming to rules. Right? You know, when you walk into a McDonald's, that the rules are you go and order yourself and you find your own table. You know, if you walk into a fancy restaurant, you stay at the door and wait to be seated. There are so many different rules that if you meet someone for the first time, you know to introduce yourself and shake their hand and that way. And there are so many rules that relate to how we interact the whole time. The whole time we are conforming to a set of rules. Most of those rules come from learning it from other people. And it's the way in which we copy and learn from other people that we internalize these rules. I love traveling because it breaks all those rules. So traveling,
Oh, right, yeah,
suddenly
yeah.
people stand incredibly close to you and you realize you're like, oh my gosh, no, you're not allowed to do that. But that's their rules. That's fine. We have different rules. And one of the things that I think is going on in culture at the moment is we're surrounding ourselves with people that have very, very similar rules to us. And we're not meeting people who have quite different rules to us.
Yeah.
And
So, and
this
we're
is
reinforcing the belief structures that we have around the rules that we adopt or adhere to, and becoming less tolerant of, because we're getting a lot of reinforcement all the time, becoming less tolerant of other people's
absolutely,
behaviors and
absolutely.
points of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the listeners want to sort of take themselves back to a moment in the pandemic when the first bits of lockdown happened. This is a really good example of when the rules changed because
Right.
it was a forced sort of social experiment whereby we suddenly didn't interact face to face. And suddenly we had a lot more time back in our homes. Suddenly we realized what it was like to spend time with your family for so long, if you had a family. And what it did is it allowed us to recalibrate some of our behaviors next to our values. So we might have constantly felt as a father of young children, which I was at the beginning of the pandemic, that it was very important for me to spend time with my children. But somehow my life had ended up where I was very busy and I was out the house a lot. And then suddenly
Culture
when I
took
was,
you another place. Culture took you in another direction.
yeah, yeah. And exactly, like the rules changed and therefore my behaviors could change. And then that was very strange at first. And then the unwinding effect from the pandemic has also been sort of a constant battle of what are the right rules nowadays. So a lot of people work in our industry, at least, you work on a computer at home for some of the time. And part of that reasoning and justification is that I want to spend more time at home with my family. And that's true. But I can do it now because the rules have changed. And these rules have started to shift since the pandemic. Right. That's fundamentally what the pandemic did to us, is it totally made us reassess our values and what our behaviors were and whether they were aligned with our values and whether we wanted to go back to that or not, whether we wanted to go back to the previous system. And we didn't. So some things have fundamentally changed.
Well, what kind of hidden rules do you think there are for leaders that are being followed, perhaps unthinkingly, which reflect culture rather than morality or internal values, personal values?
It's a very good question. And I think that anyone that leads an organization probably has to think about that quite hard. And so I've done lots of studies on workplace culture, and one of the first sort of big insights that you come across is that the personality of the leader filters all the way through the organization. And that's because whether they like it or not, they are being copied. We all copy people. That's part of being human, is mimicry.
And is compliance a form of copying as well? You know,
Yeah,
like
I think
I may not agree with somebody, but so long, to the extent that I go along with them, I'm compliant with then I'm also copying them.
Yes, yes. Now, I think in a lot of organizations with big HR departments, we try to force people to comply with the rules. And to some degree, that's necessary. And to some degree, it goes a little bit far sometimes because it makes people do things that is beyond what they really want to do. It's a stretch. You're seeing this at the moment with the come back to the office kind of movements in a lot of large corporates. Some are doing it, some are deciding not to do it. Um, but I think fundamentally, your leader is the revered person and will be the person who's copied. And that will be copied at the level down, and we copied at the level down, and we copied at the level down. And the point at which you have a point in that sort of line is if the system breaks with one of those people, then suddenly it breaks a lot further down as well, because they're, your line of mimicry. But mimicry is a fantastic thing. Mimicry is something that has really created humanity, to be quite honest. It's because we've learned the knowledge and the successes of our forefathers, our forebearers, people who are older than us. And we have inherited that as sort of embodied experience and knowledge. This is how we know how to cook so well. This is how we know how to, we create great works of literature. We have wonderful works of art because we're constantly learning from previous generations and from people who have been successful. So the leaders in organizations should really engage and step in because we need to copy their successes. That's how they've been successful, and that's how the organization has. So I think mimicry sits at the heart of a lot of these. In terms of, lessons for leaders, is that I think it's a hard one that they're always on display. They're always on display. And every little thing that they do will be copied. So one of the classic organizational difficulties is around, what style of communication do you have in a large organization? Just take the sort of basic version of this. Like, if you have sort of quite a parent-child relationship with your leaders, if your leaders sort of start telling you what to do, then this goes throughout the whole organization. If you have a much more adult to adult conversation with your leaders, then again, your whole conversation has a much more adult to adult conversation. So, and these are things that these are just comments in the moment, right? So your conversational style is just something that happens in the corridor. Have you got that report done by now? Or where are we up to with the report? Two very, very small differences, but it's a very different change in terms of hierarchy. And that actually filters all the way through in terms of how you relate to one another. So small differences, small nuances make a huge difference when a leader is then being copied.
How does cultural change happen? Bottom up, top down, catastrophe, nudge, a change in the balance of the Trinity, all of the above?
I mean, so you've got cultural change, and then you've got changes in society, changes in technology, changes in economics, and all of these things kind of affect one another. But there's a book called the Slow Time of Change, I believe it's called, and it's by an author. I'm going to forget his name, so I apologize for this. But he talks about different pace layers. And you've got things like fashion at the top, then you've got technology, then you've got governance, then you've got society, and then the bottom layer is culture. So we don't like to change. Cultural change doesn't happen that fast. But when it does happen, everything changes with it. So,
right.
So
and quickly,
you might have.
And quickly?
Yes, it can change quickly, but it's one way. It is one way. That's the way that it moves. So, for instance, there was a fantastic moment that in my opinion at least, because I'm going to show my own values here, which was the Me Too movement that basically said we need greater level of gender equality in the world, and we're going to create a movement that women can get on board with, to feel like they have kind of some level of sort of critical mass that can change certain practices in the workplace, that can move towards greater level of close the pay gap, all of these things. And that arguably had been building up for many years beforehand as women got more powerful roles in society. And then when it came through as a movement, it clearly had a lot of power behind it. And a lot of legislative change then came in to support that as well. Like, you need to publish your gender pay gap. So the cultural change happened, and then the legislative change followed afterwards. And when you get legislative change, then you really are changing society and there's constructs of it. What we didn't necessarily see, or many people didn't see quite so quickly, was that there was a backlash to that started happening fundamentally amongst men who felt disenfranchised by that. And that cultural movement, again, it started slowly. And when it first started coming through, it was slightly laughed at, or kind of really not, or slightly dismissed, if anything. And then it started to sort of garner more and more power on the internet as something that we now refer to as the manosphere, where men were talking to other men saying, this gender equality stuff has gone a bit too far, hasn't it? And actually people have forgotten that there are differences between men and women. And that then started, there was a huge amount of conversation going on there. So that really is the community side of the Cultural Trinity. There's a huge amount of conversation building up, which basically says that gender equality has gone too far and men are now being discriminated against more than women. And we measure this as a statement. And for the under 25s in the UK today, amongst men, they say there are more men who believe that men are discriminated more than women than people who don't believe that statement. Now, factually, many of those things are wrong, right? Women are still paid less than men. They are still more likely to experience violent crime on the street than men. They are still more likely to do more of the household work, and they're still likely to get less roles in film and in media. But nonetheless, when you've come from a position of power, equality starts to feel like oppression. And that has become, and that's the sort of counter movement. And this isn't something we can dismiss. This is now a very, very strong and powerful movement that, people like Donald Trump tap into and Elon Musk tap into. So we need to monitor culture, because as soon as you see something emerging in culture that has sort of power behind it, it will change so many things that are going on.
Yeah. So you say that most of today's most difficult problems often exist as social silences, and which prevent social change. And I was introduced to the idea of plurative ignorance, a term which was described to me as being a number of experts who, for instance, privately may agree that or may believe in aliens or UFOs, but publicly they believe that because they believe that everybody else doesn't believe that, they subscribe to that. So there is plurative ignorance in the public domain, even though privately there is an understanding that actually, do you know what, I think it's really going on there, but, my professional.
Yeah.
So what this means is that, we all may be thinking one thing and we all may be experiencing one thing consciously, but because our culture doesn't recognize it, it's not expressed and it's not honored and it's not part of the metric, which presumably could lead to alienation, people feeling disenfranchised, and a whole bunch of other things. How does one go about addressing those social silences? And with the work that you've been doing, how does it inform us to give us guidance really as to how culture can be changed in a positive way to overcome those social silences?
It's a very good question. It's a very, very good question. And it's got an easy answer and it's got a very, very difficult answer. So I talk a lot about social silences in the book, and I do quite a big deep dive actually on sex and the porn industry, and I deliberately do a deep dive on it because I think that is an enormous social silence. So the porn industry in the US is a $15 billion industry every year. That's bigger than Hollywood. Can you imagine an industry that size that people don't really talk about very much at all? I think that's absolutely bonkers and crazy. And what goes on in the porn industry is sometimes it's fine and safe and great, but a lot of the time it's pretty gross and it
It's not.
actually has some huge problems. So the kind of short version of the story that's in the book, which has got a lot more detail in it actually, is that we don't talk about sex. Therefore, we cannot live our best sexual lives. That means that we go and find a better performative sexual life online by looking at free online porn. That means that when we start to, that then sets our expectation for what sex should be. And therefore, when you start new relationships, you've got a whole bunch of expectations that are based on social norms from the porn industry. And fundamentally, those young people coming into starting to have their first sexual experiences, they have seen pornography before they've had a sexual encounter. So their expectations of what sex should be come from porn. And that's because we don't talk about sex. Fundamentally, parents, particularly in the UK, parents are petrified about talking about sex to their children. So it's highly likely that children have seen sex online. They've seen the discussions online about what sex is and how you have it and what happens. And they haven't had that discussion with an adult who's got first-hand experience of it. So this whole idea about what a relationship should be around intimacy and care and love doesn't come into sex anymore. So this is how social silences have social consequences. And these social consequences are all over the place. And it simply comes from not talking about things. So the simple solution is like, chat to your kids about sex. That's a really hard
Right.
conversation to have.
Yeah.
So it's a really simple solution, but it's a really hard solution at the same time. We have the same problem about aging populations and aging populations in the workplace and loneliness. We have the same problem around death and having a good death and rather than avoiding a bad death. We have the same problem about money and debt. And we have so many social silences that are simply our inabilities to speak. Now, one of the success stories that I've seen in the UK, and this is where I think brands and the private sector have a role to play, is in the financial services sector. And there are numerous sort of startup tech banks that have come in, like Monzo and others, who are basically saying, if you give me your money, I'll help you manage it better. And brand, the company, is starting the conversation amongst people, amongst individuals, on what they spend their money on. So I will get an analysis at the end of the month, which shows how much I've spent on eating out or drinking out or out of home food and drink compared to what I've spent buying food and drink to consume in my home. And I can be slightly shocked at those facts. Like that can be a bit of a wake up call and go, maybe I need to reassess some things here. So think that I would love so brands do have a role to play here if they act with integrity rather than they sort of greenwash or sex wash or money wash their brand, right? If they actually design products that are there to overcome some of these social silences, then they can have a huge impact.
Is this where we have personal agency, where we speak up, where we share, where we actually step outside of a norm and share something that I believe X, even though it may be countercultural?
Yes. I think the role of agency is coming into sharp focus these days. I see lots of commentators online talking about the role of agency these days. And that's because going back to sort of cultural mainstreams and emergent cultures, since the 2007 crash, we've largely seen a decrease in wages for normal people. And we've also seen, government support has, retracted a lot because they don't really have the money. And what it feels like is that people feel left behind and the system is broken, right? These are phrases that happen in common discourse around culture and mainstream society at the moment. The system is broken. There's the haves and the have-nots. The everyday person is being left behind. So if the system isn't working for you, then you have to have agency to step out of that and say something and do something for yourself. Again, in the world of money and finance, there's a lot of people who are massive influencers, predominantly in the manosphere, sadly, who say, I will help you get rich quick. I've got some get rich quick things, right? Listen to me. This is how I'm doing it. Right? Some of that comes from a good place. Some of that comes from a place of which says, wage stagnation has crippled the family bill, which means that you can't go on holiday twice a year. You go on holiday once a year now, and that feels rubbish. So here's a way to make some money. The fact it's linked to toxic masculinity is pretty bad, but it comes from a good place. That's what a lot of people want, to make more money than they used to, because they fundamentally earn less. So people with agency have the ability to talk about these things, and they will get an audience quite quickly. So in the world of finance, that's been an open goal that a lot of influencers and brands and institutions and banks have walked into. And I think that's great. I haven't seen it so much around aging, around death, around sex, but there is these are social silences. There are opportunities for people with agency to stand up and start talking about these things. That can happen on a small level, within a literally within a community. I would love to see schools start talking about sex a lot more. And, they've already started to talk about finance a bit more, but, just starting these conversations is going to be brilliant. So yes, agency is definitely key to that.
I like to think of your book as identifying for us the water that we swim in. The culture is like the water we swim in. It's not easy to differentiate it when it's all that there is to be perceived. But you've swum in many different waters around the world, so you can see it and you can point out the differences to us more clearly, even perhaps what the impact is when the water is a little toxic.
Yes, that's a good description of it.
I haven't had the opportunity of reading the book because it hasn't arrived yet. But from reading the notes about it that you shared with me, I couldn't help but notice how deeply materialist and physicalist assumptions are baked into modern Western culture, often without us even ever naming them as beliefs or sharing them. Would you say that materialism itself is a cultural belief system?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It has become one because it has been baked into mainstream culture for so long that we believe that this is the way forward and this is part of life. One of the, you
How
have these
long
kind
is
of,
so long?
that's a good question. So I would argue, since, it started to take hold post Second World War, and it grew and grew since then. There's a fantastic documentary by a guy called Adam Curtis. He did a 4-part series called The Century of the Self. And he looked at the role of psychology in the post-war rebuilding phase. And he maps that sort of role of psychology as a very influential way of thinking post-war all the way through to sort of the 90s, into sort of Blairite focus groups. But one of the key people in sort of embedding psychology in our life as we know it today was a guy called Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays was a PR guru, sort of started in the 30s, in the 40s and 50s. He really made an enormous amount of money. He was, on the roster of all governments and brands. And one of the things that he did was try and understand psychology from a Freudian perspective. And the reason he did this is because his uncle was Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud sent Edward Bernays his work before it had become big, before it was popularized in the sort of late 30s, I think he sent it to him. And Bernays read this and loved it. Right? He basically read that we have this ego, which is balancing the id and the superego. The superego is that very proper person that says, I really should do this. I should get up on time, and I should go to work, and I should do this. And the id is your innate desire. Like, I want to eat now. I don't care if I've just finished breakfast. I want to eat more. I want to have sex. I want to go and drink. Let's just get drunk and smoke cigarettes. And what you're doing is your ego is balancing these two things. And what Bernays realized is that if you're selling a brand or a product, you appeal to the id, you appeal to the wild side. So Bernays has got lots of fantastic case studies on how to use psychology to sell more stuff. And one of his greatest achievements that many listeners may have heard, but they may not know it's him, was that the suffragettes were doing a march. I think this is in the late 40s. They were sort of having this big march, and it was well documented. And what they did is they marched along the streets of New York, and at some point they stopped where they knew the cameras were going to be. And they looked at the cameras, and they pulled up their skirt, and inside their stocking was a cigarette. And they all took a cigarette out, and they lit the cigarette as a moment of rebellion, because women didn't smoke back then. Men smoked, women did not smoke. And this was their act of rebellion in society, to say women can do anything, they can even smoke. What many people didn't realize at the time was that Edward Bernays had convinced the suffragettes this would be a great act of rebellion. And what he was doing on the same time, he was on the payroll of Philip Morris. And Philip Morris had come to him a few years earlier and said, we've got this massive problem. We can't get men to smoke more. So he said, well, let's get women to smoke then. And they went, oh my God, 50% of the market. I can now get 50% of the market to smoke as well. So from that point onwards, women smoking was seen as an act of rebellion. It appealed to their wild side. We can tear up the rules and, do what society tells us
Interesting.
not to do. But it was
Yeah.
Bernays basically going to Philip Morris, women don't smoke. You've got a whole market there. How about that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think what's happened is that we, from that point on, using psychology, allowed people to equate something bigger with a product. So a cigarette is just a cigarette. It's not an act of rebellion until you tell people it's an act of rebellion. And then people want to buy cigarettes as an act of rebellion. Great, right? So what psychology has helped a lot of the world do is that buying a product, which is essentially becoming more materialistic, but buying a product will give you a bigger, higher order meaning in society, in culture. And by making those connections, we have become far more materialistic than we ever thought we were going to be.
Right. So how does this materialistic culture then that privileges measurables, the physical, presents individuals as separate entities, how does it shape behavior and what are people's lived experience of it? Because it's mechanical. It has quite profound implications on our sense of identity and place in society and so forth. What do you see as being the shaped behaviors and experiences of that?
Well, materialism mediates the relationships we have with people. And on some level, that's fine. It's great. It's wonderful. If I go to your house for dinner and I bring you a gift, that's a lovely thing. That's a really nice thing. We are engaging in this sort of set of reciprocal behaviors of whereby we are going through rituals that make us closer. Right? So your invitation to me and to serve food to me is a very kind ritual that says we are now getting closer and we are bonding. When the gift, right? So it doesn't really matter what gift it is. It doesn't really matter what you serve me, right? We're creating that relationship. But when what you serve me matters more and more, and what the gift I give you has more and more meaning depending on what the gift is, then we enter this sort of reciprocal dance where materialism creeps into it.
It becomes more important than the relationship.
Yeah, yeah, exactly that. One of the early studies I did for UNICEF was to try and understand how materialism and child well-being are linked in the UK. And we did this as a comparative study. So we did some research in the UK, but I also went off to Sweden and I looked at how what child well-being looks like in Sweden and what the relationship is like between children and their parents. And then my colleague went off to Spain and she looked at the relationship between families and what well-being looked like. And what I saw in Sweden was just sort of pure harmony. Right? That the parents are always there for the children because they have time, and they have a fantastic relationship where, because they have time, they play together. What my colleague saw in Spain was something kind of chaotic, but also joyous, whereby they're always off doing activities. The mum is always taking them off here, there, and everywhere. They don't bother clearing up. The house is chaotic, but the children have a great time because they're always doing activities, always doing stuff. What we saw in the UK is that parents have no time for kids. And when they do have time for the kids, they've just come off of a 12-hour shift and they're absolutely exhausted. And their kids are looking at them with expectant eyes. So the easiest thing for a parent to do is go, here you go. And those expectant eyes are satisfied. So they will give their children a gift to say, oh, I haven't seen you for a while, but I'm exhausted. But, here's a game, or here's some sweets, or here's something for you, or here's even better, here's a games console. Therefore, you can play it all the time when I'm exhausted. Materialism basically came in to the UK on a massive level into families because families didn't have enough time for their kids. And that became a substitute for reciprocity, for love, for kindness.
And so there's alienation, loneliness as an epidemic, meaning gap,
Yeah.
a great focus on competition, which is out to dominate, to garner as much of the market as possible. Collaboration goes out of the window. Um, and it's kind of relentlessly draining value from society, which is the host of most of what happens on the planet at the moment, which is business. If the future of our species requires that we come together and realize that our common ground rather than our differences is more important, how does your work guide us towards changing that cultural position at grassroots? And what role does business leadership have, do you think, to play in this bigger picture?
So I agree with absolutely everything you've said. And I think that what I see in business is that the businesses that look for short-term gains look for those, those quick wins and those little purchases and kind of like tap into materialistic culture. The businesses that stand for something generally play a bigger role in culture. Now, I think that they are more successful long term as well. Everybody always uses these like big brands as ideas for how the world should operate, but that's because they're successful. And so Nike is quite an interesting brand from that perspective. They're huge, right? They sell an enormous amount of products to such a varied number of people, but they do stand for something. And they do stand for something that I believe encourages connection, which is so their internal tagline is if you have a body, you are an athlete. That means that they make their products available to everyone and anyone in every different size, in every different level of athletic ability. And they try and point out where there is right and wrong in the world. The Colin Kaepernick example of them sponsoring Colin Kaepernick once, the American footballer, once he'd been cancelled essentially by Trump for taking the knee and he could no longer get an NFL contract anymore. They put his banner, his face on a 20-meter billboard in the middle of Times Square, which says, I can't remember the phrase exactly because I'm terrible at paraphrase. I always paraphrase rather than do the exact phrase, but stand for something, always stand for something, even if it means giving everything up. And they basically said this level of inequality, this level of racial discrimination within the NFL is unacceptable. Now, that was a very bold statement for a brand
Yeah.
to make. But what they were doing is they were saying, come together. We are not a brand that believes in discrimination. We are a brand that believes in coming together. And it's authentic with what they believe, which is everybody should be given a chance to be an athlete. And that, I believe, means that they have a very strong cultural position, a very strong cultural positioning. Whether you take other brands that do it sort of want to try and do a quick fix on some of these things, it just doesn't work so well. It means that you end up you appeal to the id. Nike wasn't appealing to the psychological inner desires of people by putting Colin Kaepernick's face up there. They were saying there's something much more important, which is
Yeah.
equality in society. Other brands just go, I need to know your innermost desire so that I can sell you something so that in that moment you'll be satisfied. When that moment's gone, we don't care for you.
Looking perhaps more towards the policy side, you say somewhere that we treat cultural problems, like for instance climate denial, as purely psychological ones rather than cultural. And I look at that and I think to myself, well, that's probably quite convenient because it means that the government can say it's not our fault, it's your fault, you're the problem. So we'll put you in a psychiatric ward, or we'll lock you up, or we'll cancel you in some way.
Yeah. I think that, there's a lot of people in the world and in society that believe that many of the answers come from inside our head because that's the place where we have control. So we like to think of problems as psychological problems because we can change our own personal psychology and therefore we must be able to change someone else's personal psychology. The reality is a lot more complex than that, and it's to do with a web of interconnections, which is why we believe the things that we believe. So when it comes to sort of big thorny policy problems, we try and use a lot of psychological nudge techniques. We try and change people's behavior by changing people's thinking. So, for example, I did a lot of work with Public Health England, and Public Health England Their role at the time was to make families healthier through their campaign, which was called Change for Life. And through Change for Life, what they basically said was, we want to reduce childhood obesity. Right? This is a fantastic thing. Second thing they wanted to do, they wanted to help parents reduce childhood obesity in quite practical terms. So basically, eat less, move more. So send your kids out in the street to play more, get them doing lots of activities, and B, here's some healthy meal plans so that you can eat more healthily. This sounds intuitively good. And after 5 years of running, they hadn't made a dent in childhood obesity. They really just hadn't touched it. So we went and did some ethnographic research with families across the UK, and we found some really obvious things. Busy families are really busy. Most families are overworked. Most families put a long shift in at work, then they come home and they're exhausted and they want nice things at home. What they want to make is the foods that everybody loves. They want to make mac and cheese. They want to make shepherd's pie. They want to make, sausage and mash. They want to make these things because that helps people feel good.
Yep.
And that's a worthy thing. That's a
Yep.
totally worthy thing. So if you're telling your a parent to substitute sausage and mash for halloumi and couscous, like, no, I'm not going to. And the more you tell them that, the more they're going to say no. And what they want to do, and a lot of these people don't live in places in the countryside or with a playing field next door. A lot of these people are quite scared of what happens on the street. So why would they send their kids outside to run around when actually that's quite a scary prospect, right? Actually, the living room is a place where people bond, right? So you at least see you might be watching TV together, which is unhealthy, but at least you're bonding with your kids. At least you're chatting to them. At least you're in the same space as them. So the psychological nudge techniques were actually counterintuitive because people started hating Change for Life. They started going, no, this is not what I want. So what we did actually is that we said to them, look, your strategy is actually making things worse because parents are coming up with reasons for doing the things that they're doing. And they say things like, oh, I just want to give my kid body confidence. Giving your kid body confidence sounds like a really positive thing to help a child feel good and make sure they're not bullied in the playground. And that's more important to a family than being a bit bigger. But as far as Public Health England are concerned, parents have made the best excuse to counter these nudge techniques. They've really entrenched their position. So actually, we started working with Public Health England. We did an awful lot of ethnographic research with them. We showed them that this was the problem. But what we did actually is we showed them that there was a common enemy. And we showed them that parents come home, they're exhausted. Kids are all wide-eyed and expectant, right? And what the kids love is a treat. They come, parents who are exhausted, they're like, oh my God, all right, okay, here you go, here's some sweets. Buster. That's even worse because then kids go off the wall and they start bouncing around, they start, causing chaos, and then they become a bit annoying and naughty kids, and they might be sent to their room. So what Public Health England did is they actually changed their strategy to look at sugar. And they said sugar is the common enemy. Sugar is unhealthy, it leads to obesity, but it also leads to bad behavior. And parents want to combat bad behavior. So Public Health England did a campaign about how much sugar was in different products. They created an app which you could hold your phone up to any different product, and it would show the number of sugar cubes that were in a product. They're like, why are there 2 sugar cubes in a can of Heinz tomato soup? And what's going to be the consequence of that on my kid? So suddenly, and the campaign was incredible because parents were like, yes, I agree, sugar is bad. So suddenly you had this like groundswell movement because you had a common enemy. And that created a cultural shift whereby people started to reduce the level of sugar. Once they started to reduce the level of sugar, Public Health England were then able to put a bill through government that said, we will tax sugary products more than non-sugary products. And because the culture had already changed, the bill was easy to put through. And then, so I think over a 3-year period, that they had reduced the level of sugar intake of children by 1/3 in the 3 years, which is just huge. It's a huge
Huge.
amount
Yeah.
in terms of health outcomes. Mm. And that's because they looked at it from a cultural perspective and stopped looking at it from a psychological perspective.
Yeah. Excellent example. With an eye on time, we haven't yet mentioned the word AI or the initials AI, but I do want to cover something. Um, you talk about we are becoming cyborgs, or we are already cyborgs.
Yes,
Tell us a
I would
little.
argue
Tell
we
us a little,
are.
please.
So for for as long as humans have been working together to create humanity, we have created tools in order to help us. Right? We have walking sticks to help us walk. We have bicycles to help us, transport a bit faster. We have cars to go even faster. We have airplanes to go even further. So we happily incorporate tools into our life to make our own abilities better. We cannot fly, but we can create tools to help us fly. So therefore, we are essentially flying. We like to separate these things out to go, no, no, the aeroplane is separate to me. But it's not separate to my endeavors. It's not separate to my ability to achieve the things that I want to achieve in life. Now, we are adopting, like, I can't really navigate around London anymore without a phone. And I have to plug in a postcode. I'll try and look at the routes, try and think about it. And I cycle around London all the time, but I can't really get around London without a phone anymore. So my abilities are wholly reliant on having a phone. And we are incorporating technology into our lives and into our ability to achieve things, so much so that if we took the technology away, we couldn't achieve the things that we need to achieve. I couldn't find my way across London without technology. It would take me forever. I could go back to a map, but actually I can't find a map because we've ditched them. So we are naturally bringing technology into our life to the point where I believe we are essentially using technology to our own ends, like it is part of us. We like to think of a cyborg as whereby part of us has been removed and a machine has been put in. And that looks kind of cool or scary or weird in sci-fi, but it's kind of the same thing because I never go anywhere without my phone, anywhere.
Yeah, yeah,
And we've just it's an external thing, but it's kind of internal. Now, AI is learning from us in order to act like us. And we will soon all have our own personal AI that we deliberately train in order to act like us when we are not there. So all of the companies, the AI companies, are basically in the process of building some sort of device that is deliberately designed to listen and understand what we do so that it can help us. It can become a personal assistant, if you like. At the moment, it can mimic our writing style, but it can soon learn what time we wake up, what time we feel better when we wake up at 7 o'clock or when we wake up at 8 o'clock. And it can then start to prompt us to act in certain ways. And this will happen because it will become so convenient that we can't not do it anymore. That's how technology is embedded in our lives all the time. A technology that's 5 years away seems really, really scary. But technology that's 2 months away is just really convenient. And eventually that 5-year technology will only be 2 months away, so it'll become very convenient. So I believe now that we are essentially a cyborg and we cannot live without technology. Now, to some degree, I'm okay with that. I don't mind that really, right? Because I've accepted it in so much of my life. As long as the technology does what I need it to do rather
yeah,
than what other people have designed it to do for me. So the level of collaboration in how we design technology and how we design this personal AI is so crucial. And that's happening right now. And what I want in life is I want to be connected to people that I know and love on a better level. Now, if I look at the development of social media, that's what it tried to do at the beginning. And then it became heavily monetized. And if I look on Facebook now, which I have to say I don't, but once every 2 years I'll log on to Facebook, I don't see anything that's happened from any of my friends. I see influencers on there that I've never met before. I see brands on there that I don't buy. And I see these really stupid reels of videos of I don't even know what, but it's not connecting me to people. Instagram is not connecting me to people anymore. So that's how we become a cyborg becomes really, really important. And the level of control that we have over technology is also utterly crucial, and how we need to start designing that together.
The interplay with identity is one that concerns me if I um, can pick out one particular item. I think you say that AI is an extension of human identity, and I can see that happening because we displace some of our knowledge onto the AI, and we get AI to do things for us. But if we go a little bit further than that and go, oh my God, my goodness me, AI knows all the answers and it's not me. And actually, I must ask AI what to do next. And we begin to see AI as being the conscious one, the more superior one, and we subjugate our own beingness to the machine, then that's quite a dangerous step. And I see also the possibility of bad actors who control the algorithms, who are making the robots, almost kind of allowing people to sleepwalk into that kind of situation, where indeed the robot is in charge, not the human. Do you see
Absolutely.
do you see that as a potential danger?
Yes, I see it as a huge danger, a huge danger. And I think it's essentially going to rewire human cognition in a way that I'm very nervous about. So one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea that we're probably sleepwalking our way into a place of digital narcissism. So that process that you've just described essentially means that let's start in the private sector, that any brand can talk to me in a way that it knows I really, really like. So it's not a million miles away that you can imagine an AI bot is creating an advert that is only ever seen by me, that has learnt what I like, and it learned it had a look at my holiday photos that I put online, and it knows that I like beach holidays. So the setting of the advert is on a beach. It knows that I'm, a slightly rounded middle-aged man with ginger hair. So it kind of puts an actor in there that's kind of like me, wearing clothes that are kind of similar to mine. And essentially it just does a mirror image back at me. But at the end of it, it says, buy this jumper or buy this watch or buy these glasses. And I will go, of course, it's amazing. Why wouldn't I buy it? It looks incredible. Right. But that's all I'm ever seeing. I end up in a very narcissistic hole that is what the world looks like. That's so firstly, on a kind of materialistic level, that's a disaster. Secondly, on a cognitive level, that's incredibly narcissistic. Thirdly, you then translate that from the private sector where you can go, look, okay, fine, I'll put some morals aside. These are things that I like to buy anyway, so why not serve me up the things that I want to buy? If you give me like a little vesty thing and advertise that to me, I'm not going to buy it anyway. So what's the point? Translate that into politics, and suddenly you have
Yeah.
an election that comes up and an advert that is only served to me with an election promises that only I hear, that no one else hears. It's narrated by an actor or someone that I respect. So David Attenborough suddenly narrates the campaign message for reform, and it tells me some things about reform that I might weirdly be aligned to or something. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great, isn't it? And imagine that everybody in the country gets a different campaign message. That is an incredibly corruptive force upon
Yeah.
society.
Yeah.
And on a personal level, we will expect the world to serve us all the time because
Yeah.
we believe that's what it's there to do. So
Yeah.
I see the development and the kind of level of digital narcissism that's being baked into AI and how it's going to be used on a commercial level as deeply problematic.
Any quick fixes for that, or any policy approaches that you would think we need to start following? Is it about guardrails? Is it about ownership? Is it about sovereignty?
I mean, I
What are
think
the
all of
things that we can be doing or paying attention to some
I
degree guard against that?
I haven't actually investigated down that line enough to have a good kind of structural level understanding on what should be done in terms of how those things develop. But I am much more focused on what individuals should be doing in order to guard against that. And I think the first thing that you can do as much as anything is just learn a ton of kind of digital literacy, right? So, and with kids as well, kids need to know that when they log on to something, that's being saved. And I mean, I teach my kids all about advertising and what advertising is there to try and do. And every time they see an advert now, they're going, they're trying to make me buy that, so therefore I don't want to buy it. Right? Like if we get in there young enough with digital literacy about algorithms and how that creates an echo chamber and how actually stepping outside your echo chamber is incredibly exciting, and going and visiting something completely new and different is incredibly interesting and eye-opening. Um, I focus much more on what the little person needs to do in order to protect themselves. But I'm sure there's a huge amount of legislation and structural stuff that needs to happen as well.
Ollie, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. You've been very, very generous. It's been an enlightening conversation, and thank you for being our guest today on Metaconscious Leaders. I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to want to talk to you, want to contact you. Where can they do that? Where can they find your book? And I will put any links and connections in the notes below.
Fab, thank you. The book is on Amazon and many other good retailers like Waterstones and others elsewhere. It's called The Rules That Make Us. Pre-orders are out now. It releases on the 26th of February and then should be distributed around the country in various bookshops, which we should all support. I work at Ipsos Murray, as it used to be known. So I'm on their website, and I'm very active on LinkedIn as well under Oliver Sweet. So those are the places.
Brilliant. Ollie, thank you very much indeed. Go well and be well, and many blessings.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
I'm really appreciative of Ollie for sharing those unique insights with us today, and I really hope that you got as much from them as I did. To find out more about Ollie, please find the links in the show notes below, and I hope, like me, you'll order his book, as it's clearly one for our time. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, as this greatly encourages the algorithms to spread our conversations to a wider audience. I think you know the routine by now. And leave a comment, because we love hearing about what you're thinking as well. This is Metaconscious Leaders with me, Greg Suart. Until next week, be present, be centered, and be well.